Question number 12, Von Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, yes.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does he stand by his immigration statement in July where he said, quote, we're sticking to the plan, we're going to stick with the plan we've got, end of quote. And if so, how's that plan working given the weekly fraud reports coming out of New Zealand's Mumbai Immigration Office?
Either of those two supplementary questions, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, and answer the first part of the question, then yes.
Order. Order. Every member has a right to ask a supplementary question. Fletcher Tabuto.
They've made my day, sir.
Order.
To the Prime Minister, does he stand by his statement in relation to the TPPA that if we have to give more, then we would expect to get more? And if so, has he forgotten his horrible record of over-promising and not delivering, like the 10 bridges in Northland, Puhoi to Warkworth Highway and the ultra-fast broadband in those areas?
Again, either of those two supplementary questions, the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in answer to the first part of the question, yes.
Order. I do need some order. I need some cooperation, particularly from one member who I'm looking at towards my right. Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, is he as, quote, highly disappointed, unquote, with Jerry Brownlee as he was with another person who misbehaved at Christchurch Airport when Mr. Brownlee illegally entered a secure area, then gave untruthful reasons, according to the CAA, why he did so, and cost taxpayers $43,000 for the investigation?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, they're very, very, very different events. And it would just be wholly inappropriate for me to comment on either of them in a great depth.
Order. Supplementary question, Dennis O'Rourke.
To the Prime Minister, if he has a, quote, comprehensive housing strategy, unquote, why are consents in Auckland lagging thousands behind what is needed, and why are code compliance certificates not counted to show just how few houses are actually being built?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member really needs to direct those sort of detailed questions to the Minister of Housing, but what I can say is we can see from the most recent data that consent numbers are up, as we can see from today's announcement in relation to house prices in Auckland. They seem to at least be cooling a bit, although let's see what happens over the medium term.
Order. Supplementary question, Ria Bond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, how can he expect, quote, higher standards of his ministers, end quote, when his Minister of Health's underfunding has led to 30 patients at the Southern DHB suffering sight loss in 2015 to 2016 because of unacceptable delays?
The
Speaker,
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I don't accept the proposition that's the case in health funding at all, and you saw the largest amount of money going into health funding in Budget 2016 in the history of New Zealand. Can I also say to the member, can I thank her and her colleagues for her questions today? I now feel I know the New Zealand First Caucus better than Winston Peters does.
Order. Point of order, Grant Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate in the situation that we're in that there might be some interjection. I just would ask you to reflect on the way in which you're dealing with that versus the way in which you've dealt with some other interjections on this side. And I'm not saying that you were wrong to deal with them on this side, but were we doing that, I wonder what you might have done.
I think that's a fair point, but we're witnessing a tactic that we don't see every day in the House, and it's certainly causing some commotion. I'm dealing with it to the best of my ability, but there are two. I can assure the member there are 2 or 3 people I have in my sight, and if they continue to cause me trouble, and if I can identify them as causing that trouble, they'll get very similar treatment to Mr. Lees-Galloway or worse. Supplementary question.
To the Prime
Tracy
Minister.
Martin.
Does he stand by his statement that Stephen Joyce is, and I quote, doing an excellent job of improving results in the tertiary sector, given his failure to act on complaints about fraudulent qualifications at the International Academy of New Zealand in 2014, and is currently ignoring similar complaints regarding another high-profile tertiary institution, also in Auckland, lodged with that minister in May 2016?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do stand by the view that Stephen Joyce is doing an outstanding job, and the only complaint I hear is one from a car somewhere, goodness knows where in New Zealand, of Winston Peters screaming out, "Why is it taking 6 of them to have a go and none of them can land a single blow?"
Order.
Point of order?
Order. Order. This is a point of order, and it will be heard in silence. Tracy Martin.
Sorry, sir, just to clarify, the question was, did he stand by his statement around the tertiary minister? What relevance did the second
Order.
part
No.
have?
If the member's arguing the question wasn't addressed, it was very clearly addressed. Richard Prosser, do you want to proceed with this supplementary question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Mr. Brownlee, I need to ask for your cooperation completely between now and the end of question time. Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, how can the liquidation sale of Solid Energy's assets be, quote, good news, given the price of coking coal has doubled this year and taxpayer assets worth $3 billion only 7 years ago have had to be sold at receivership prices, partly to overseas interests?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, it was, of course, relative to what they thought they would get for the assets, which was a much lower number. Mr. Speaker, I certainly hope that member hasn't hogged the question and Barbara Stewart's not going to get a go.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that they recognise an impact off the benches and something they lack themselves.
Can we have the supplementary question, otherwise I'll move on?
Absolutely you can, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary question to the Prime Minister.
If the member wants to ask...
I know they rarely see talent.
Order.
They rarely see talent.
Order. The tactic's been tried. The members can judge themselves how successful it's been. Now, if the member wants to ask you supplementary, get to his feet, ask it, and no further interjection.
Nice. Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, how can he say, quote, law and order is an area that the government cares a lot about, end of quote, when crime statistics to the year ending September 2016 show an increase in assaults, an increase in abductions, increase in sexual assault, increase in robbery, increase in extortion, increases in burglary offences, as long as we have just as we have long projected they would be, all under his leadership.
The Right Honourable
Mr. Speaker, I stand by that statement because overall crime has reduced since 2011, 15%, although I acknowledge it's up 1.4% in the last 12 months. And Mr. Speaker, thank goodness Steve Hanson's policies of taking Bowden Barrett off the bench was a lot more successful than New Zealand First.
Order. Order. Point of order, Lees-Galloway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek your ruling, and you may wish to take some time about this. What does it take to get a National Party MP put on a final warning?
Order. That is quite a serious direct criticism of the chair. If the member wishes to criticise the chair, there's a way to do it. It's not that way. And that concludes questions for oral answer. I have received